I didn't know he was there. I didn't know he'd walked in just seconds earlier, quiet as ever the way he always did, never the type to make noise, never the type to announce himself. I thought I was safe to speak freely. I thought what I said wouldn't leave that conversation, that moment, that room. But I was wrong. So wrong. And by the time I turned around and saw the look on his face, it was already too late. It was supposed to be a light-hearted girls' night. Just me and my best friend drinking cheap wine, venting about our lives the way we always did. At some point, the conversation drifted like it always does toward our men. The things we wished they'd do, the fantasies we had about being swept off our feet or rescued like in the movies. We were laughing, not taking anything seriously. And then I said it. Honestly, he's not like other men, I laughed, tipping my glass. If something ever happened, I don't think he'd know what to do. He's just not strong like that. I didn't mean it cruelly. At least I don't think I did. It was one of those careless things you say when you're trying to be funny, to bond over shared complaints, to fill the silence with something light. But the weight of those words, they hit the air like a stone through glass. And suddenly, the room felt heavier, colder. I turned to grab another bottle from the kitchen, and that's when I saw him, standing there, still, silent. His eyes didn't widen. His face didn't twist in anger. He just looked at me like something inside him had been severed, something he didn't know could ever break. He didn't yell. He didn't ask me to explain. He didn't even raise his voice. He just said, "Okay," turned around and walked out the front door. No bag, no shoes, nothing. Just gone, like I had flipped a switch that couldn't be turned back off. And in that moment, I didn't even know how to react. My friend stared at me wide-eyed, and I remember laughing nervously, saying, "He's probably just going for a walk. He'll cool off." But he didn't come back that night, or the next, or the one after that. That one sentence, 10 words I didn't think twice about was all it took. And what followed was a silence that stretched into days, then weeks. A silence that said more than any fight ever could. A silence that made me realize I didn't just hurt his pride. I'd crushed the one thing he never asked for recognition on the way he loved me quietly, constantly, and without needing to prove anything to the world. This is the story of what happens when the words we throw away come back to destroy what we thought would always stay. We met in the most unremarkable way, which, looking back now, feels painfully symbolic. Not in some whirlwind cinematic fashion. Not in a grand moment filled with fireworks or sparks. It was at a bookstore, quiet, tucked away in a forgotten corner of the city. I was browsing through the psychology section, pretending to be more intellectual than I actually was, and he was standing beside me thumbing through a book on philosophy with this curious look in his eyes. He didn't say much, just glanced at the title in my hands and said, "That one has a good ending." Then he left. No name, no cheesy line, no lingering stares. Just that. It was only when we ran into each other again 2 weeks later at the same bookstore, same aisle, that we actually exchanged names and numbers and something else neither of us could define at the time. He wasn't loud or flashy like the men I used to date. He wasn't the type to take over a room or flood my phone with texts. He didn't send flowers or write long poetic paragraphs. What he did was remember the little things like how I took my coffee, what songs made me cry the name of my childhood cat. He was quiet but thoughtful, steady. He never made grand promises, but he always followed through. If he said he'd pick me up at 7, he was there at 6:55. If I had a bad day, he didn't tell me to toughen up. He just sat beside me in silence until I felt like speaking. He was in every way a safe place. But here's the truth. No one really talks about sometimes when you've spent too long in chaos. Peace feels uncomfortable. I was used to loud love, messy love, passionate arguments, and dramatic makeups. I'd grown up in a house where silence meant something was wrong. So when I found someone who didn't raise his voice, who didn't storm out of rooms or slam doors, I didn't know how to interpret it. I mistook his calm for passiveness. I mistook his patience for weakness. At first, I adored how gentle he was. I loved that he never interrupted me, never tried to overpower me. But slowly, as months turned into years, that admiration began to warp. I started to wish he'd be more assertive, more confrontational. I wanted someone who would grab life by the throat, who would shout back at the world with me. And though he loved me the best way he knew how, with quiet consistency and unshakable loyalty, I began to crave the chaos I had once sworn I'd escaped. It wasn't his fault. He didn't change. I did. Or maybe I just let the noise of the world get too loud in my head. I'd see friends with partners who were more manly, more dominant, and I started to compare. My best friend's boyfriend once threw a punch defending her in a bar fight, and all I could think was, would my boyfriend ever do that for me? I never said these things out loud, not at first, but they festered, quietly, like a rot beneath the floorboards. We had our struggles, of course. Every couple does, but they weren't the kind you'd see in a movie. There were no betrayals, no scandals, just slow, subtle fractures that came from mismatched expectations and unspoken resentments. I wanted him to fight for things. He wanted peace. I wanted fire. He brought calm. We weren't wrong for each other. We just didn't know how to meet in the middle anymore. There was one moment I remember vividly, probably because it was the first time I ever saw a crack in his calm. We were at a family dinner and one of my uncles made a crude joke at my expense. I looked at my partner expecting him to say something to defend me, to step in, but he just smiled awkwardly and said nothing. That night I cried in the bathroom. Not because of the joke, but because of the silence. He found me later and asked what was wrong. I told him I was just tired. And like always, he believed me. But I wasn't tired. I was disappointed. I had built up this version of him in my head, one where he'd suddenly transform into the man I thought I needed. And every time he didn't, I resented him a little more. It wasn't fair. He never claimed to be that person. He never promised he'd be a shield or a sword. He just wanted to be a soft place to land. And I had forgotten how rare that truly is. Still, I kept those feelings buried. I didn't want to hurt him. He was good. He was kind. But eventually, that resentment slipped out in the ugliest of ways, disguised as a joke, dressed up as humor, said in the safety of a conversation I thought was private. He's not strong like other men, that's what I said. And he heard every single word, and that's where everything began to fall apart. You don't usually notice when the pressure starts to build. It never arrives with a bang or a warning. It creeps in, slowly wrapping itself around little things, turning moments that should feel normal into quiet tests you never signed up for. At first, it's just a glance at another couple, at the way he places his hand on her lower back, the way he speaks up for her in a group, confident and bold. And suddenly you're wondering why your man doesn't do the same. Not because he doesn't love you, but because now love feels like it should look a certain way. And he doesn't fit that picture anymore. The comparisons started small. My best friend's boyfriend, Mason, was loud and assertive. When we went out together, he took charge, he ordered the drinks, decided where we sat, even intercepted a guy who was getting too close to her at the bar one night. I remember watching her lean into him afterward, all giggles and pride. I remember thinking, why doesn't my boyfriend ever act like that? And then, like clockwork, I'd feel guilty. Because mine was kind, because mine listened, because mine made me soup when I was sick and never forgot an anniversary. But the guilt didn't stop the thoughts. It never does. Those thoughts eventually grew roots. They started coloring the way I saw him in everyday life. I began to pick apart things that never used to bother me, the way he hesitated before confronting someone, how he avoided conflict at all costs, how he never raised his voice even when he was angry. Once our upstairs neighbor was blasting music at 2 a.m. I nudged him awake and asked if he could go say something. He rubbed his eyes, sat up, and said, "I'll talk to the landlord tomorrow." I remember looking at him in the dark, a sharp bitterness rising in my throat. "You're seriously not going to do anything I asked?" He didn't argue. He just laid back down. I turned away from him that night, and though I didn't realize it then, a wall had started going up between us. I told myself I was just frustrated, that it was just one thing, one moment. But it wasn't. It became a pattern. Every time he chose diplomacy over defense, calm over confrontation, I saw it as a failure. I started viewing his strengths as shortcomings, his emotional intelligence, weakness, his quiet support, lack of courage, his patience, passivity. And what hurt the most was that he never saw it coming. He kept loving me in the same soft way, never suspecting that I was slowly pulling away emotionally, mentally, because I had convinced myself I needed something else. It didn't help that social media painted a different version of love. My feed was full of couples going viral for their dramatic love stories. Boyfriends defending their girlfriends in public, men showing up with extravagant gestures, husbands fighting off rude in-laws in viral clips that made thousands cheer. Strength, it seemed, was loud. It had muscles. It shouted back. And the man lying next to me every night didn't do any of that. He just held me close and asked how my day was. And I hated myself for thinking that wasn't enough. The pressure built in silence. I didn't talk to him about how I felt. I didn't give him a chance to prove me wrong. Instead, I stuffed it down, letting it come out sideways through sarcastic remarks, passive-aggressive jokes, sudden coldness. I'd snap at him for being too soft. I'd make comments like, "Sometimes I feel like I'm the one protecting you," and he'd just smile or nod or ask if I was okay. He thought I was stressed. He thought I needed space. He didn't know I was stacking up emotional evidence against him, convincing myself he wasn't what I needed simply because he didn't match someone else's definition of masculinity. One night after a dinner party with friends, I remember us walking back to the car. It was late and a group of rowdy guys were shouting on the sidewalk. I instinctively moved closer to him, expecting, I don't know, that he'd put an arm around me. Say something reassuring, but he didn't react. He just kept walking, and nothing happened. We got to the car safely, just like always. But I was furious that he hadn't made a show of protecting me, furious that he didn't even notice that I was scared. And when we got home, I started a fight over something petty, his tone, his choice of words, anything I could cling to. He tried to de-escalate it calmly like always, and that just made it worse. Because I didn't want calm. I wanted proof. I wanted passion. And I didn't know how to tell him that. Instead, I started venting to my best friend. Not with intention, but gradually. A story here, a complaint there. I'd say things like, sometimes I just wish he'd stand up for me, or, he's so emotionally reserved I feel like I'm dating a monk. We'd laugh about it, brush it off. But I was laying the groundwork for that moment. The moment I'd later regret more than anything else. Because the more I compared him to others, the less I appreciated who he truly was. The more I chased a fantasy version of what strength looked like, the more I undervalued the strength he showed every single day. The strength to love without ego, to support without conditions, to stay even when I was pushing him away. And all of that came to a head the night I said the words out loud, not to him, but loud enough for him to hear, loud enough to break everything we had quietly built. It happened on a Friday night, the kind of night that wasn't meant to matter. Just me and my best friend curled up on the couch in sweatpants with our third glass of wine, old playlists running in the background, and candles flickering lazily on the coffee table. The air was warm with the comfort of routine. Nights like that were our ritual, a way to vent, to laugh, to slip into a version of ourselves that wasn't so tightly wound by real life. He had gone out earlier for groceries, just a quick run or so, I thought. I didn't even hear the door open. I didn't know he'd come back early, and I certainly didn't know he was standing behind me only a few feet away when I made the one joke I never should have made. It started innocently, as it always does. My friend had been venting about Mason again, how he was too controlling, how he picked fights over nothing. I remember her rolling her eyes and saying, "Honestly, sometimes I wish I had your guy. At least he doesn't flip out all the time." I laughed maybe a little too loudly and waved it off. "Yeah," I said, "but sometimes I wish he'd flip out just once." She laughed too, and I kept going. Like, he's so calm, it's almost boring. I swear, if someone tried to rob us, he'd probably offer to help them carry the stuff. We both chuckled at the image. I should have stopped there. But something in me, a part I hadn't dealt with, a sharpness I'd buried under months of comparisons and dissatisfaction, pushed the joke a little further. "He's not strong like other men," I said. "He's sweet and all, but come on. He couldn't protect me if he tried." The moment the words left my mouth, I felt a shift. The air didn't feel warm anymore. It felt wrong, still, heavy. My friend's eyes widened, not in laughter, but in something closer to dread. And then I heard it. The faintest sound of movement behind me. I turned slowly, and there he was, standing in the hallway. No expression on his face, no anger, no hurt, just nothing. Like a light had gone out, like a switch had been flipped, and whatever held us together had quietly, completely disconnected. He didn't speak, not right away. He didn't ask me to explain, didn't raise his voice, didn't even frown. He just looked at me like I was someone he didn't know, like I was someone he never wanted to know. Then calmly he said, "Okay." That was it. One word. He turned around, walked to the door, and left. No yelling, no slamming, no drama, just silence. The kind of silence that says more than shouting ever could. I stood there frozen. My friend sat still, her glass in her hand, her mouth slightly open, but no words coming out. It took me a full minute to process what had just happened, and even then, I couldn't believe it. "He'll come back," I said quickly, too quickly. "He just needs some air." But deep down, I knew better. There was something final in the way he walked out. Like he had made a decision in the space between hearing my words and reaching the door, and once he made it, there was no going back. That night, I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling and replayed the moment over and over, dissecting every syllable. Not just the words, but the way I said them, the tone, the laughter, the absence of defense when he heard. I didn't even try to stop him. I didn't say, "Wait, that's not what I meant." I just stood there, frozen by shame, paralyzed by how effortlessly I had torn him down. Because it wasn't just a joke, it was a betrayal, a public declaration of everything he feared I believed, but never said. And now I had said it, out loud, with a smirk, in front of someone else. I didn't just question his strength, I belittled it. I mocked it. I turned his greatest effort, his quiet consistency, into a punchline, and he heard every word. The next morning, his things were still there. His toothbrush, his favorite hoodie draped over the armrest, but it all felt like a museum of someone who had already left. I texted. I called. Nothing. No response. My last message was a long paragraph, half apology, half panic, telling him I was drunk, that it was just a stupid comment, that I didn't mean it. But he knew I did, because those kinds of words only spill out when they've been waiting too long inside. And maybe that's the part that hurt him the most, not the joke itself, but the truth behind it. He had been loving me in the only way he knew how, and I had spent months silently measuring him against men he never asked to compete with. I had been building a case against him, and he didn't even know he was on trial, until he heard the verdict that night. And by then, there was nothing left to defend. He didn't come home that day, or the next. The silence stretched on thick and punishing. The house was still, like it was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do next. But the truth was, I had already done enough. And he had already said everything he needed to, with one word, one look, and one door quietly closing behind him. In the days that followed, the silence became unbearable. It wasn't just the absence of his voice or the sound of his footsteps down the hall. It was the way the whole house seemed to mourn him. The rooms felt colder, quieter, as if even the walls understood that something important had been lost. I kept expecting the front door to open for him to walk in, holding a bag of takeout like he used to do after a long day. I imagined it so vividly that once I even rushed to the door when I heard footsteps outside, only to find a neighbor passing by. Reality hit me like a brick. He wasn't coming back. At least not today, maybe not ever. I spent the first 2 days in denial. I kept checking my phone, refreshing my messages, waiting for a notification that never came. I told myself he needed space, that he just needed time to cool off. I rehearsed apologies in my head, ones that sounded heartfelt, sincere, but also casual enough to make it seem like I hadn't fallen apart in his absence. I played back that night over and over again, wondering what would have happened if I'd caught myself sooner, if I'd turned around just a minute earlier, if I'd said something, anything to stop him. But you can't rewind real life. You only get the aftermath. By day 3, the denial cracked into guilt, heavy, ugly guilt that settled in my chest like a stone. I thought about all the times he had been there for me without asking for praise. The way he supported my career, helped my mom with her garden when her back gave out, stayed up late editing my portfolio before big meetings. I remembered the way he always made sure I had an extra phone charger in my bag, how he'd remind me to eat when I got too wrapped up in work, how he never let me walk on the side of the street closest to traffic. These weren't grand gestures, they weren't viral video moments, but they were love, steady and unshakable, and I had reduced it all to a careless joke. I wandered through the apartment like a stranger. His side of the bed stayed untouched. His toothbrush was still in the holder. His coffee mug, his favorite one, the one I had bought him on our first trip together, sat on the counter where he left it. I couldn't bring myself to move any of it. It felt wrong, like erasing him would only make the absence worse. So I let everything sit exactly as it was, like time had frozen at the moment he walked out. My friends started texting, asking how things were going. I ignored most of them. What was I supposed to say, that I broke my own heart with a joke, that I took the best man I ever knew and pushed him away because he wasn't loud enough, aggressive enough man enough by someone else's standard? The truth was too embarrassing, too raw. So I stayed silent just like he did. It wasn't until a full week passed with no word from him that I realized he might not just be angry, he might be done. And that terrified me more than anything else, because now the silence wasn't just a punishment. It was a possibility, a real, painful possibility that the man I took for granted, the man I measured against the wrong standards, had reached his breaking point. I started writing letters I never sent. Long, rambling letters filled with apologies, with memories, with things I should have said a long time ago. I wrote about the night we stayed up talking until 4 a.m., the day he met my dad and brought him his favorite beer, the little post-it notes he used to leave on the mirror before I went to work. I wrote about the way he made me feel safe without ever raising his voice, about how I now understood that his quiet love wasn't weakness, it was strength in its most selfless form. I cried more in that week than I had in the past year combined, not because he was gone, but because I had been blind. Because I finally saw him for who he was, and he wasn't there to see it. One morning, I got out of bed and walked to the living room. The sun was pouring through the windows, and for a second I forgot everything. Then I saw his jacket still hanging on the back of the chair. He always left it there, even when I nagged him to put it away. I used to hate how he never listened about that, but that morning I curled up next to it and cried like a child. Because that stupid jacket was all I had left of the man who once made my world feel whole. People think heartbreak is always loud, that it's screaming, slamming doors, dramatic exits. But sometimes heartbreak is silence. It's realizing that someone walked away, not because they didn't love you, but because they finally understood that you didn't love them in the way they deserved. Or maybe you did, but you didn't show it until it was too late. That's what haunted me most. Not that he left, but that he left so quietly. No revenge, no shouting. Just the quiet dignity of a man who'd spent years giving love without needing to prove anything, only to be dismissed in a single sentence. And now I sat in the wreckage of that sentence, finally understanding its weight. It's strange how your definition of strength can change not in a moment, but in hindsight, after the damage is done. After the silence stretches too long to ignore, after you've sat alone for days running your hands over things that used to be his hoodie, his old notebooks, the side of the bed he never let get messy. It was in that silence that I began to understand just how much I had misunderstood him. Not just as a partner, but as a person, because what I had called weakness was never that. It was just a different kind of strength. One I hadn't been wise enough to see before. Growing up, strength always looked a certain way to me. It looked like a man who raised his voice and commanded a room. It looked like clenched fists, booming laughs, and a protective arm thrown in front of you at the first sign of danger. It looked like confidence that bordered on arrogance, like power that made people step aside. And I suppose somewhere along the way I started to believe that was the only way strength could look. That if someone didn't stand tall and loud and in control, then they must be lacking something. I didn't realize that maybe I'd just been taught the wrong version of strong. because now that he was gone, all I could think about were the moments I used to overlook, the quiet ways he held me up when I didn't even know I was falling, like the time I was passed over for a promotion I really wanted. I came home crying angry, ready to quit. I expected him to tell me to fight to storm into my boss's office to demand better, but he didn't. He just sat next to me on the couch, took my hand, and said, "I know it hurts. You gave it your best, and if this place can't see it, maybe it's not the place you're meant to grow." I remember looking at him waiting for more, waiting for that fire and fury type response. But he didn't offer rage, he offered perspective. And at the time, I called it too gentle. Now I call it wise. I started recalling dozens of little moments like that. The night my mom called me in tears after her doctor's appointment, and I panicked, ready to book the first flight home. He didn't try to take over. He just made me tea-packed my suitcase without asking and quietly rearranged his schedule so he could take care of things while I was gone. He didn't make speeches. He took action. Calm, steady, compassionate action. And yet, I had once called that weakness. I thought about the way he handled conflict. He never belittled me, never yelled, never slammed a door. If I raised my voice, he'd let me get it out and then say, "Can we talk about it now?" He never escalated, never retaliated. And it used to drive me crazy. I mistook his peace for passivity. I thought that if he really loved me, he'd fight louder. But now I see that the real fight was in how much he held back for my sake for hours. It takes more strength to stay calm when someone you love is throwing fire at you than it does to throw fire back. I started realizing something else too, how different things might have been if I had just told him what I was feeling instead of comparing him to everyone else in silence. I never gave him a chance to meet me where I was because I never admitted I was lost. I just silently measured him against impossible standards, waiting for him to fail tests he didn't even know he was taking. And then, when he didn't meet those unspoken expectations, I mocked him for it. I see now that I was the weak one. I didn't have the strength to appreciate what I had. I didn't have the strength to communicate, to be vulnerable, to admit I was wrong. I used sarcasm to cover my dissatisfaction, and then I used a joke to destroy everything we built. But what hit me the hardest was this. He never tried to prove me wrong. He didn't come storming back in to show he could be strong in the way I wanted. He didn't send angry texts or beg for me to see his worth. He just left, quietly, with dignity, and that more than anything redefined strength for me. Because it's easy to yell, easy to lash out, but to walk away from someone you love when they can no longer see your value, that takes a kind of strength I don't know if I'll ever have. I found one of his journals tucked beneath our bed a few days later. He never let me read them, but now that he was gone, I opened it. And there, on a page written months ago, was a line I'll never forget. He had written, "Sometimes I wonder if she wishes I were someone else. But I don't want to become louder just to be heard. If she can't hear me when I whisper, she won't understand me when I shout." I sat on the floor for hours reading that page over and over, feeling each word cut deeper than the last. It's a strange kind of grief, the kind you create with your own hands. Knowing you had something rare, something whole, and you broke it not with betrayal, not with infidelity, but with ignorance, with ego, with a joke. And now, all I'm left with are echoes of the quiet strength I didn't recognize until it was too late. He never came back. I kept hoping he would, that maybe one day I'd open the door and he'd be standing there with that soft, steady expression, the one he wore when he forgave people before they even asked for forgiveness. But no, he didn't come back. Not after a week. Not after a month. Not even after I sent the letter I poured my heart into. Silence. That was his answer. And I understood. For the first time in our relationship, I truly understood why he left. And more than that, why he stayed away. Some people leave you with scars. He left me with a lesson, one I carry in everything now, in how I speak to the people I love, in the way I listen when someone shows me love that doesn't fit the mold I thought I needed, in how I pause before using humor as a weapon. Because what I lost wasn't just a man, it was a mirror, one that showed me what kind of partner I really was, and the reflection wasn't easy to look at. I think about him sometimes. not in the way you might think. I don't romanticize what we had or daydream about getting it back. I think about the way he made me feel safe without ever needing to say, "I've got you." He just did. I think about the way he loved in the spaces between words, in the small, invisible things most people would miss. I think about how rare that kind of love is, and how quickly it can disappear when you don't know how to receive it. There's something haunting about being left by someone who never raised their voice, someone who didn't try to win, didn't try to hurt you back. He just left quiet, proud, and certain that he deserved more than someone who didn't see him clearly. And now I see him everywhere, in the way I second-guess my words when I'm frustrated, in the silence I sit with instead of filling it with sarcasm, in the men I no longer chase because they're loud and aggressive and strong. I see him in my growth, and that's how I know he mattered. That's how I know he still does. So, no, he never came back, and he probably never will. But his absence taught me more than his presence ever could have. And if I could speak to him now, I wouldn't ask for another chance. I'd just say thank you for loving me the way you did, for walking away with grace, and for showing me that strength isn't in how loud you are. It's in how quietly you choose yourself when someone else refuses to. To anyone listening who's ever doubted the worth of a quiet partner or dismissed someone because they didn't fit your idea of strong, don't wait until they're gone to realize what they were giving you. Don't mistake softness for weakness, because real strength is often the quietest thing in the room, and when it's gone, the silence it leaves behind can be deafening. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you or made you reflect on your own relationships, I hope you'll share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you're the kind of person who loves softly, steadily, without needing a spotlight, don't change. The world may not always see your strength, but those who matter will, and those who don't, they'll learn, eventually.